guarantee that everyone in this room has had to undergo some sort of testing. And if you're anything like me, you've had those questions where you have to pray that you filled in the right bubble so that you get a good grade. But why do high scores matter so much? It's because standardized testing nowadays is a big deal. Every year, thousands of students take the SAT and ACT and pray that they get a good score so that they can get into their dream college. But since testing affects us so much, it's important that we know the flaws involved with it. Which brings us to our research question. What are the flaws in standardized testing, and how do they affect students in schooling? Standardized testing has been around since the World War II era, and though McDougall says it's an essential source of information to students and parents about student learning, standardized testing does help people, but it also hinders students as well because of the importance that's put on it and the bias presented in it. And Celeste will talk more about the importance of standardized testing.
So the problems with standardized testing include the importance that is being put on the exams and the bias that is presented on these exams. Today I will be discussing problem 1, which is the importance that is being put on the exams, and then Ruthie later will be discussing problem 2, which is the bias that is presented on the exams. The importance that is being put on standardized testing is leading to an increased focus solely on getting results or meeting a standard. This has caused achievement-based learning, which is when students become emotionally invested in their test scores, which has caused them to start thinking negatively about themselves when they receive a score that they do not like. We see this in Kelligan's 2012 article. Next, in Sonert's 2019 study, we see that an increased weight on standardized tests has caused students to start studying a lot more, and they're starting to create bad study habits, which is hindering their long-term memory, which is not good for classroom learning. The long-term memory helps with classroom learning, so it is not good that standardized testing is affecting this. Lastly, score discrepant students get lower scores on tests compared to their grades. We see this evidence from Hurwitz and Lee's 2018 article. Ultimately, students might not achieve their dream because of their test scores that they are receiving. This has started to cause stress, negative thinking, affect their futures, hinder their long-term memory, and just overall affect students' confidence. Next, Ruthie will be going over the second problem of standardized testing.
Right, so the second problem with standardized testing is that multiple studies have shown that standardized testing is biased against students with low socioeconomic status and racial minority students. According to Young Choi, an educator and test proctor, because it is common knowledge that racial minority students tend to score lower on standardized testing, it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy for students of color who take the test. Studies have also shown that test designers will rely on background knowledge, more commonly held by white middle-class students. These tests will include questions that require knowledge of things like golf, tennis, polo, and horseback riding, which are activities that lower-class individuals don't often have access to. According to Harvey Gilmore, a Monroe College professor, there is a direct relationship between SAT scores and socioeconomic status. The lower the socioeconomic status, the lower the score. This happens because lower-class individuals don't often have access to the materials and resources to adequately prepare for the test. Now Kaylin is going to introduce our first possible solution to these problems.
Our first solution is to take emphasis off of standardized testing and put more emphasis on other things such as grades, classroom achievement, and extracurriculars to fully showcase the talents of the student. This also makes teachers more apt to teach not to the test, but so the students remember what they're learning. James Naughton has a quote that says, "Respect for diversity. Each student should be recognized for his or her own abilities, interests, ideas, needs, and cultural identity." This helps institutions such as colleges and employers focus more on the student themselves instead of just their grades and their test scores. Students should be recognized for all their hard work, not just their tests. This also makes important their characteristics. Sometimes students' characteristics can get overlooked, and it can persuade an employer or college not to choose that student. Not all students are normal for standardized testing, as Naughton said. This means that standardized testing was developed for the stereotypical American, which is not what it is made of in most of the American schooling system. which makes it incredibly biased towards those people who are not the stereotypical American. So when colleges can go into student backgrounds, they can see their skills and they can see what they're good at and more than just their tests. Pros and cons. Some pros, we can adequately evaluate students, and a student can show off who they are in the classroom and through their other achievements such as sports or other clubs. Some of the cons are that some students rely on studies to do well and show their value. Some students don't have much to show for in the classroom. Implications and limitations start with a full evaluation takes much longer. It's much easier to just look at a test score than it is to look into a student's background, such as their extracurriculars or in-classroom performance. This would also take every college or other institution to get involved. We would all have to agree that this is a new standard that we should all follow, and that is incredibly difficult. It is also difficult to shift away from standardized testing, which America has leaned on for so long. Now Alana will talk about our second solution.
Our second solution is to help prepare students for the test and gain better testing skills. This seems to be a more reasonable solution for our problem because it can be more easily integrated into the everyday school. By making a class that happens within school or requiring students to take prep classes, students would improve test-taking skills. With the right resources and teachers, many more students would sharpen their skill sets, being motivated by their classmates and having no excuse not to be prepared. Not only would this class include standardized test prep, but it would also include good test-taking skills that would aid later in life, but especially for the SAT, ACT, and other high school tests. There is significant evidence for students that show if test prep is given, the scores are directly affected. Bachman says that multiple types of preparation have a significantly positive effect on test scores, and the combination of public and private education or tutoring has been shown successful in studies. Also, McDonald says that holding educators accountable for their teaching is also a good solution. By holding teachers accountable, students will be better looked after in the classroom. There are many pros and cons to this solution. Some pros would be that this would give students the choice and a chance to prepare from a teacher or administrator that is there to help them. In addition, parents would not have to worry about spending extra time or depriving their child of having access to test prep. Some cons may include time, money, and adequate teachers are sometimes a struggle to find, considering that both public and private schools need outside funding, and sometimes they don't even have time within their schedules to add extra classes. Currently, it can be a struggle to find teachers that will be available and proficient enough to teach a test prep class. Some implications include specific time within the school day to be taught on how to do well for standardized tests. Also, students with fewer opportunities and materials have access to tools that they wouldn't regularly have. Some limitations would include money, people, and other resources would have to be used within the school, whether that calls for an extra paycheck that may result in raising the tuition. Also, students that don't learn well in a classroom setting could struggle even more, and this doesn't set them up for success. And now Maddie will be concluding our presentation.
In conclusion, the flaws presented in standardized testing presented by Celeste and Ruthie are achievement-based learning and bias towards minorities, and the solutions presented by Kaylin and Alana are to put less importance on tests and implement classes into school that students can take if they feel they have less opportunity or don't know enough about test preparation. Thank you.
Okay. Maddie, what is a way in which your team's resolution makes you think differently about your own individual research?
Yes. So my own individual research was geared a lot more towards achievement-based testing and how standardized testing has caused schools to have more importance on outcomes and performance over process. And as I was reading my peers' papers, I realized that they focus more on the biases involved in standardized testing including those towards minorities such as lower socioeconomic groups, and that helped me think more focused on like groups of students rather than all students as a whole.
Great, thank you. Celeste, give one specific way your thinking changed as a result of learning about another student's findings.
So one way my thinking changed was when I read Maddie's paper, which was written from the artistic/philosophical lens. She discussed in her paper how like standardized tests affects like all students like mentally, and my paper was more about like how it affects like more like minority students. So it was interesting to see like how like a standardized test affects everyone and not just those minority students.
Great, thank you. Ruth, how did your group decide to include Kaylin's perspective, lens, or conclusions into the overall presentation?
Right, so Kaylin's lens was more of like an ethical lens, so he focused a lot about the ethics about standardized testing and our solutions, so his insight was actually really helpful when we were trying to figure out solutions to the problems. I know my research wasn't really solution geared versus his really was, so that was really helpful when figuring out our solutions.
Thank you. Kaylin, if you had another team member, what other perspectives or limitations could they have researched that would have made a useful contribution to your project?
If we had another team member, I would ask that they look through a futuristic lens to see that if we use the solutions that we provided, what that would look like in the future. So how that would affect what we know is standardized testing today and how that could change for the better. We'd also have them look into a way of, if there's ever been anybody that's tried to change standardized testing, look back a little bit to see if anything has changed, where it's come from, but more of a futuristic perspective to see what we can do in the future to make this better.
Thank you. And Alana, what is an example of a compelling argument from one of your peers' individual reports that you decided to exclude from the presentation, and why?
I would say that we kind of excluded part of Celeste information because she came from a scientific lens. We decided to go more with statistics and history, which were more of my lens. And so we decided not to use as much of her information and to rely more on numbers and statistics and what had happened now in our solution, which tended not to include her information and research.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, we have a couple minutes and press record, start recording, we're good, you guys can begin.
We've all learned about the various wars and conflicts that have happened throughout history between various different countries. And between all of these different wars and conflicts, whether or not we know it, there have been various methods of propaganda that have been spread during these wars. So the wars that we studied specifically included the Cold War, the two world wars, the Vietnam War, and the Korean War. So we defined propaganda from Merriam-Webster, and we defined it as propaganda is the spreading of ideas, information, or rumors for the purpose of helping or injuring an institution, cause, or person. So our research question was, in what ways does war propaganda influence the perspective or the perceptions of the other during conflict? So Tucker's going to talk about the problems we experienced in this question.
So throughout our research, we exemplified a problem, and this problem was countries were not considering the effect of propaganda on the innocent bystanders living within the area where the propaganda is being utilized. And this propaganda is mainly being utilized through the radios, cartoons, educational systems, posters and films. So propaganda was like everywhere. You couldn't go anywhere during these periods, these wars, without getting some form of propaganda from your country or from other countries. And the main problems we found that according to Motor SE, the Hungarian government during the Cold War would send back letters with U.S. post stamps commemorating NATO. So this affected the bystanders of people who were sending the letters, but also who were supposed to be receiving those letters. So they weren't receiving their letters, and they may be losing contact with family members or friends who are living across the world. And then according to Soper, during the First World War, propaganda was utilized to reduce bystanders of other countries to the idea that they're inferior or evil. So this would make U.S. citizens think that people living in Germany are evil or they're less than us. So we have two proposed solutions. The first would be an international propaganda committee to regulate propaganda. The second one would be to mandatory propaganda education for U.S. citizens. So Luke is going to talk about what solutions others have proposed.
Yeah, so I don't know why it doesn't have it up here, but for our two solutions that other people have proposed, there's been the first one, which is setting up events. The main thing is setting up events mainly in school systems for faculty and also students as well. And the main idea for this is that we want to target people while they're in their early stages and to make sure that they know about the effects of propaganda, and that teachers can also mentor the students and make sure that they also know about the effects and are able to garner support for it. The second one is not as common. It's to do nothing. People say that propaganda is not a big issue. It's not something that we need to focus on, which really is not true. It really is a big issue, and it truly is something that we need to focus on and we need to address immediately, however that might be. All right. So we got some problems with these solutions. So the first one with setting up events is usually there's not very great support for it. I know going to an event that's not very fun. If it's not a party, a game, anything like that, why would you want to spend your time on it? Why would you want to go to it? Why would you do it if it was something that had to go out of your time? It's very hard to want to do that. And I think it's also very hard for people who have already been affected by propaganda for them to say, sure, let's just change our ideas and let's just go on to what you say. And for doing nothing, as I said before, it truly is a problem, and we really need to focus on making sure that we do something one way or another. And I will have Kevin explain what our solutions are that are better than theirs.
So yeah, the first solution we had is an international committee that would regulate the propaganda. So as we saw throughout all the wars we looked at, propaganda creates a distorted perception of the other. Dietrich Kohl looked at Nazi Germany and the Jews during World War II, and he just looked at how the Nazis created an us versus them mindset and portrayed the Jews as weak and inferior, and other stuff like that just happened throughout all the wars we looked at. And so propaganda created and encouraged hostility towards the other, and it just shaped overall public perception and encouraged harmful things more than it created hope for their own country. So how this would work would there would be two representatives for each country. They would focus on global cooperation, and they would prevent harmful propaganda and from misleading propaganda from spreading. Some pros of this include reducing harmful propaganda, protecting innocent civilians, and there would be more communication between countries. Some cons, however, include countries might resist the regulations that are tried to be made, and it would be hard to enforce it globally. Some implications would be it decreases dehumanization and other harmful propaganda, but some limitations would be it would be hard to start. It would rely on the cooperation of everybody, which we know it's pretty hard to do that, get everyone to agree to something, and enforcing rules would be hard. So now Evan will explain the second solution that we have.
Our second solution would be to create some sort of educational system where we can teach children as they're in school more about propaganda and how to steer away from that. Children at young ages are really malleable and are susceptible to being formed about what they see, and especially with social media right now, like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, and the news, and what they see is really about what they how they act and what they hear. So especially if there's a conflict going around, everything that they see and they hear is going to make them how they act and how they think of others, and that's going to really reduce their empathy of the other, especially the other country. And the problem with this is that both countries do the exact same thing. And I looked at this Korean War, and one of the big parts of that was that they created like movies and films where they had their side being the heroes and the other side being like the villains and the aliens, and the other side did the exact same thing. So people make their side think that they're the good guys and what they're doing is actually good for their country, and the other side is evil and trying to manipulate them, when in turn the other side does the exact same thing. So it's kind of like this ongoing spiral that we can't really stop. The good thing about what this could do is it would resist the distortion that goes on in children, and it would increase empathy towards the other side, especially during conflicts. And then it would also stop the manipulation of others and the manipulation of young children in their minds when they're young and able to be formed. And then it also would inform the society and let them stop being so ignorant of the problem that we have in every day-to-day life. Some pros and cons of this. The pros would be that it's really good for the society. It would really help us to have this be less of an issue and more of something that we can solve now. But the problem would be that it would probably take about a decade to fully get this into the school system and get this into something that we can have in day-to-day life. Now it's Macy to wrap this up.
So our research question overall that we answered was how propaganda influences the perception of the other during conflicts. We came up with the two solutions for the International Propaganda Committee to regulate the propaganda, and then the mandatory propaganda education for United States citizens, so that people understand the harmful effects and ways that propaganda can dehumanize the enemy or just general societies and people groups during war. And these solutions do have limitations and implications, but overall this could really help make worldwide conflicts more humane throughout history and in the future.
Thank you. Macy, if you had another team member, what other perspectives or limitations could they have researched that would have made a useful contribution to the project?
I think if we had another group member, I would say that they could look up another way that propaganda was used during a less known war or conflict, something that, like we researched really big, well-known wars that you study throughout school and in history classes, but I think propaganda is used even in conflicts that aren't technically wars, so I think that could have been a really interesting thing to see how propaganda could be used just with outside of battles and things like that.
Thank you. Tucker, how did your group decide to include Evan's perspectives, lens, or conclusions into the overall presentation?
So Evan's lens was the lens of the Korean War. And in the Korean War, he showed a lot of how propaganda was used to affect the innocent bystanders. So we used that overall just to shape our idea and create our problem. And he also proposed in his research one of our solutions to educate people about propaganda. So we also used that solution in our presentation.
Thank you. Luke, describe an argument from one of your peers' individual reports that made you think differently about your team's solution or conclusion.
So Tucker researched the Cold War, and in his conclusion paragraph, he was stating that propaganda can be a great tool for good or for bad, and he stated how it is most times used for bad, not for good. And I use this in my paper as well, because I was able to also find some sources that were similar to what he said, and it was able to affect our group in general in a positive way, in order that we would all be able to benefit from his research.
Kevin, reflecting on your colleagues' work, which one had the greatest impact on your overall understanding of the problem your group identified?
I would say Macy's research had the greatest impact because her research really showed how propaganda uses emotional tactics and rhetoric to influence and the perceptions of others. And it really just helped me see how it's been going on throughout many different, well, everyone's to see how it's going on through many different wars, but hers specifically to see how it affects people and generations for them down the road and overall just countries as a whole. And it really just helped me see that a solution really needs to be made to stop that.
Thank you. Evan, what is an example of a compelling argument from one of your peers' individual reports that you decided to exclude from your presentation, and why?
Yeah, so Luke looked a lot at empathy and how it really cut the string between how countries felt about each other and how they could sympathize. And we decided to exclude this and focus less on how countries' people related with each other and focus more on how the countries overall can focus on being less rash towards each other. So we just got rid of the point where it was less people, more overall broad.
Thank you very much. All right, I need to push record and you can begin.
Transgender athletes in women's sports. So recently, huge moral and political debates are starting to arise regarding transgender women playing in biological female sports. Women fought for their own leagues to have their own safe space and community to include others and to have their own stuff to get out of the stigma of playing in a men's league. And now, today, over 235,000 women play in college athletics. And recently, the trans women are wanting to play in more college athletics with biological women. Oh, wrong way. The history of women's sports is very big. Granted that women needed to have their own league in order to do their own stuff. And a historian named Sarah Tietzel published a book called Transgender Eligibility Policies in Sport, Science, Ethics, and Evidence. And in this book, she said, despite advantages in gender equity over the past few decades, transgender athletes and coaches still face pervasive prejudice, transphobia, and heterosexism in sport. And although that may be true, more trans women are starting to play in college sports and pro athletics. There was a recent influx in trans women playing in college sports, going from around 10 people in the year 2000 to around 40 now. And here are 3 trans athletes. The first one is Mien Bagger, who is the professional golfer, Fallon Fox, who is the boxer, and then Tiffany Abreu, who is the volleyball player.
So the first question that we have to examine when we approach this issue is it actually legal for these athletes to be participating alongside biological women in women's categories? And the most hotly debated piece of legislation that I found was Title IX of the Education Amendment Acts, which prevents discrimination on the basis of sex in the workplace, and that also extends to school athletics. And then the following question is, does that also apply to transgender athletes in women's sports? So what Title IX does, advocates of this will say that yes, it does extend to transgender athletes, while the opposition will say no, it only extends to protect biological women. And in order to answer this question, we have to look back to 1972 when Title IX was enacted, because the Supreme Court has ruled that the intent of any piece of legislation is determined by the time of its enactment. And when Title IX was enacted in 1972, the issue of transgenderism was not as prevalent as it is today. So it did only extend to protect biological women. So as of right now, their laws could change, but as of right now, Title IX does only extend to protect biological women. And then next is discrimination. Transgender athletes will argue discrimination when they are denied access to their sport. And when we're looking at like the laws put in place and the historical laws put in place to protect women against discrimination, we see that it was mostly put in place to prevent preferential treatment that benefits a man at the expense of a woman. And right now in sports, that could look like cisgender women who are forced to share intimate spaces like locker rooms with transgender athletes without their consent. So as of right now, there are no laws that protect or allow transgender athletes to participate in women's sports. And now that we have looked at the legality, we can look at some of the lawsuits that have been filed for this.
Alright, lawsuits and injuries are very big and one of the main discussions because obviously biological men are bigger and stronger than biological women, and how does that affect them in their sports? There have been multiple athletes that have been injured. On the top there, Sophie touched on it briefly. That is Fallon Fox, the transgender MMA fighter, and that is Tamika Brants, who the trans woman had to fight against. Tamika Brants is a biological woman. The fight lasted 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Tamika lost the fight, had to go to the hospital with a fractured orbital bone and 7 staples in her forehead. And Peyton McNabb is a high school volleyball player who had to play against a trans woman in a volleyball competition. The trans woman spiked the volleyball into her head, causing her to fall backwards, getting a concussion and neck injury. That was in September of 2022, and she is still recovering and will never, the neck injury, obviously it's head trauma, so she will never fully recover from that. Peyton McNabb now works alongside Riley Gaines, a NCAA college swimmer who had to swim against Leah Thomas. That is Leah Thomas right there, who is a trans woman. And Riley Gaines, alongside Peyton McNabb and 15 other biological female athletes, are currently suing the NCAA for allowing transgender athletes to participate in their sports. Obviously, this is a very big issue as they're now letting there's transgender athletes in high schools, and a lot of parents are either pulling their daughters out of the sports because of locker rooms and just trans athletes participating in the first place, and suing the schools for allowing their daughters to be in the same intimate spaces like Emma was talking about as a biological male. Obviously, these injuries are because of their biological differences, which Kiara will talk about how we can fix that.
So many people turn to the solution of hormone therapy, but it still leaves question on the unalterable physical advantages that these transgender athletes hold. So it is scientifically proven that men outperform women on largely increasing numbers because of their testosterone levels. And a study done by Laura Cudadro found that cisgender men outperform cisgender women by 12% in running and swimming, 20% in jumping, and over 50% in throwing events like baseball. And this is a large reason why people are fearful of transgender athletes in women's sports. So people turn to hormone therapy to figure out if it works or it doesn't. And there's been numerous studies, some advocating for it and some not. But most studies, like this study done on a cohort of women treated with estrogen, found that trans people can reach female range at virtually all times, but this still questions some other advantages that these athletes might have, like their height, wingspan, and their cardiovascular health, which is found that it can remain unchanged after 2 years of hormone therapy. So there's really no clear path to fairness because hormone therapy cannot make them biological women. So
their physical advantages are still there overall.
Even though athletes can change their hormone levels, there's still the discussion about women in these spaces. Now, there's primarily locker rooms and podiums, which most women will say that they don't want a biological man in their locker rooms, and especially not on their podiums when they worked hard for their goals and achievements, which brings up the discussion of privacy, fairness, and comfort for these athletes. However, on the opposing side, there's the emphasis on inclusion and equality for LGBTQ plus members. Now, female athlete Riley Gaines described her experience with a transgender female, Leah Thomas, in her locker room, stating, "My teammates and I cut wide eyes with each other, not really understanding our emotions at that moment. Of course, we felt awkward, embarrassed, and uncomfortable. I remember specifically feeling betrayed. I thought of how our privacy as females had been entirely dismissed, violated, and ignored. There was no thought of how we would respond or how uncomfortable a male sharing this changing space with us would make us feel." Now, her coming out has brought up a lot of support from other biological females who, again, agree with her that there was lack of consideration when female athletes were in these changing rooms with biological men who still had men genitalia. Next is, now Leah Thomas was the swimmer that was in the same locker room with her, and she competed in multiple NCAA Division I freestyle events where she took home new gold medals and set new school records. However, her titles were later removed and, quote, "Under the agreement, Penn agreed to restore all individual D1 records and titles to female athletes who lost to Thomas and send a personalized apology letter to each of those swimmers," says ESPN. Now, the LGBTQ plus was obviously outraged. They believed that this was not fair inclusion and not a display of equal rights for their swimmers. Now, Leah Thomas later responded, stating, "I knew there would be scrutiny against me if I competed as a woman. I was prepared for that. But I also don't need anybody's permission to be myself and to do the sport that I love." Together, these examples illustrate the ongoing tension between concerns about fairness, privacy, and inclusion and equality.
So what are some of the solutions we can implement for this? The first one that we discussed was implementing an open league where transgender athletes, men and women, could all play together in a single space. And one of the main reasons for this was that it would provide a space where women would be knowingly competing against transgender athletes instead of like walking into a game and just realizing that they're competing against this and like they're surprised and they didn't know. And we also figured this would make a more even playing field if transgender athletes on both teams and men and women on both teams, it wouldn't be as much of a discussion where one team has a significant advantage over another. Some limitations of this, though, are it would be a much smaller demographic than even most professional women's leagues today. There aren't too many transgender athletes seeking to compete at the professional level as of the moment, but hopefully implementing an open league would invite more to come and pursue the sport they want to play. Another limitation is funding. That it would be hard to fund a league like this. You'd have to find some supportive brands. We thought about maybe Nike could be a supportive brand. And also equipment differences, because men and women in multiple different sports use different size equipment. Men use a larger basketball than women do, and they have a higher volleyball net size. And we figured to kind of balance that out, you could do the majority of whichever team is playing, will, like the gender they identify as, you could use that size of equipment.
The next thing we talk about is hormone regulations, but for timeline, they would have to be doing hormone therapy for 2 years, and it's like preferred to be before puberty because it works better, and then they'd have to have gender affirming surgery, and they would be tested multiple times to make sure that they're still in female range. And the limitations of this is that therapy can be very expensive, and also if you're having to undergo 2 years of therapy before you can compete, you're missing crucial time that you can be training and maybe like competing in the league.
So what does this mean? So debates surrounding transgender athletes in women's sport reflect broader tensions shaped by historical efforts to create equal opportunities for women athletes, evolving legal protections, and ongoing questions about fairness, safety, hormone therapy, and access to gendered spaces. We hope that our solution of an open division or hormone regulations can hopefully combine these tensions and create a more equal playing field that includes all. Because it is important that as a nation we stay united and strong together. We should still include all, but not at the cost of another athlete. Thank you.
Sophia, describe an argument from one of your peers' IRRs that made you think differently about your team's solution or conclusion.
Well, Kiara had a really great argument about hormone regulation, that she said that it really works better before puberty. And in our conclusion, we did state that it would be harder to include people who didn't do hormone regulation before puberty, and that just really changed my perspective on how our solution would work out in the future.
Great, thank you. Emma, what is an example of a compelling argument from one of your peers' IRRs that you decided to exclude from your presentation, and why?
In Bree's paper, she talked a little bit about how some people might believe that transgender athletes have ulterior motives in competing in women's sports, that like they just didn't want to do it in their own, they couldn't make it in their own league, so they wanted to move to a women's league to like make it easier and get that spot, whatever. But we decided to exclude this because we felt like it distracted a little bit from like how the problem goes both ways, how these transgender athletes want to compete but they like can't, and how women don't want to compete against them. And we felt that it just distracted a bit too much and it made it a bit too biased to one side.
Thank you. Elizabeth, give one specific way your thinking changed as a result of Emma's findings.
I think Emma's findings were really good, and I think just like the legality and how Title IX was not originally, I did not know this, but I did not realize that Title IX was not originally put in place to protect trans athletes, but just women's athletes. So it takes away from the argument that both sides are using Title IX, and just how complicated the legality of all this has gotten, and why it's such a big problem, and why courts take so long to make a decision on it.
Thank you. Kiara, what is a way in which your team's resolution makes you think differently about your own research?
So before like we started our whole research for hormone therapy, we put that as one of our solutions, but before I didn't know that it actually had like good results, and like there's tons of studies done that actually prove that these trans athletes are getting the results. So I just learned that hormone therapy can be used, and especially pre-puberty, it has really good effects.
Thank you. And then Bree, reflecting on your colleagues' work, which one had the greatest impact on your overall understanding of the problem that your group identified?
On the overall problem, I would say was Elizabeth's, because she brought up a lot of the injuries that were created, and a lot of athletes, that was a main priority for them, is that there's a biological strength difference between men and women, and especially when we saw that image of the boxer, how beat up her face was, it's definitely scary, and it brought to our attention more of just how prevalent this topic is, because not only is there just kind of this fairness aspect, but there's actual injuries to go with it.
Great, thank you. Here we go. All right, go ahead and push your record button.
According to Professor Brand, beautiful things share objective features in the world, while persons experience the subjective property of pleasure. Beauty may have certain recognized shared features, but when society treats beauty as this objective, accepted truth, then harmful beauty standards can emerge and can be used to judge and exclude others. One of the biggest ways, our research question is, in what ways do beauty standards influence how individuals are judged or othered based on appearance? One of the biggest ways that beauty standards can harmfully become internalized is through social comparison, firstly through models and online figures. In a study conducted on social comparison, Erin Strahan differentiates the figure of the average American woman to the average American model, the average American woman being 5'4" and around 140 pounds, while the average American model is 5'11" and 117 pounds. She then continues that these models are thinner than 98% of Americans. These are extremely jarring proportions. It's completely feasible that they would cause unhealthy comparison in most individuals. But these comparisons are not only in models, even our peers can directly affect how we internalize beauty standards. In a study conducted in 407 Chinese college students, Jian Tingxin highlights how communication alone in peers affects focus on appearance, formation of ideal body standards, and development of body ideals. So why does this happen? According to the social comparison theory, these comparisons may arise from areas of self-interest and improvement motives. So this goes to say that the comparison is not always a conscious choice. It's sometimes a natural response in order to improve yourself. I'm going to briefly touch on social media, so Savannah will continue into this, but I want to talk about how social media affects social comparison. In a study conducted in 16 to 24-year-olds, 9 out of 10 responded that they view themselves negatively. 3 out of 4 responded that they wish they could change one or more aspect of their bodies, and 1 out of 7 responded that they had thoughts about ending their lives in response specifically to social comparison in social media. So while social comparison lays the foundation for how beauty standards can emerge, social media brings these forces into an everyday, constant visibility where millions are exposed.
So one of the main ways that individuals experience these beauty standards is through social media. It's one of the leading sources of not only spreading these beauty standards, but also creating them through the images that are put out on social media platforms. There are perfect pictures and unattainable standards and expectations that are more normalized and expected. A study in the National Library of Medicine says that social media is a very prominent part of most youths, with 95% of ages 13 to 17 responding that they have a constant use of social media platforms. Beauty standards become more common and they become a goal for these viewers and a standard that they set themselves to, and it shouldn't be because they're not realistic and they're often unattainable. Most photos put out on social media platforms are edited in some way to affect their appearance or improve how they are viewed. A research study conducted by Khadija Atek and other medical researchers explains that a systematic search among young adults shows that the unhealthy use of social media, and more importantly, appearance-based tools affects or is a leading mediator for BDD, which is body dysmorphic disorder. Body image becomes more of a concern, and a way to lower the risk of lower self-esteem from these is to put a watermark on most edited images to show that they are not realistic and they're not an authentic picture. Those who don't fit often have lowered self-esteem and they feel that they're not good enough or that they need to compare themselves to others. Since the standards are so narrow, there is a wide variety of people who are affected negatively from these standards, and the people that are permanently situated outside of them, based on things like race or genetics, are commonly othered from the rest of society.
As human beings, we all want to be beautiful and accepted. It's simply in our nature. However, our group took a look at 3 specific demographics that mainly feel these beauty standards, including women, Black people, and men. Women is the most stereotypical demographic. Their looks are extremely important to them, and they put a lot of their self-worth in them. They're constantly exposed to perfection in the media, per Andrea Moronica, a plastic surgeon.
They see these perfect models online, like Savannah mentioned, and they feel like they need to look like them in order to be beautiful. And since so much of their identity surrounds how beautiful they are, this greatly impacts them in a negative way and can lead to body dysmorphia and many other negative habits. Black people also are othered by these beauty standards. Gaines, a professor of Africana Studies, and Masonary Thatcher, a social worker, explained that whiteness has become synonymous with beauty. The standards are very white, unfortunately, and this isn't necessarily bad in itself. However, it makes those who are not white feel that they cannot be beautiful. You can't simply change your race. Therefore, these people are not able to conform to the white standards and feel like they are beautiful themselves. This creates feelings of isolation and that they're not beautiful themselves, which can again lead to very negative self-image. The last group, and the group that gets overlooked the most, is men. 60% of men feel pressure to achieve a perfect body that isn't attainable naturally. This is from Dr. Kennedy, the psychiatrist. Men are unique in the fact that they don't feel like they can necessarily talk about their desire to be beautiful. It's seen as too feminine or not masculine enough. Therefore, they internalize many of these desires, and it causes them to feel even more isolated and can lead to great mental health and issues.
Now we'll take a look at how these narrow beauty ideals impact your mental health on our young adolescents. So, these narrow beauty ideals often force yourself to compare yourself to others, which leads to negative body dissatisfaction and to view yourself in a negative light, which results in anxiety, eating disorders, and unfortunately a lower quality of life. Milligram explains that a study of over 850 individuals shows a strong comparison and link between negative body perception and also lower quality of life and mental disorders. So if you're constantly comparing yourself to others, you often think that you're never going to be good enough to fit into these narrow societal pressures, which often results in you wanting to change how you look, which results in eating disorders, and often puts a lot of anxiety on the person not being able to fit into society. One author states, who looked at over 200 studies, the negative consequences of poor body image cuts across all key areas of living, including physiological and physical functioning. So it doesn't just impact one day, it impacts your entire lifespan and can ultimately lead into lower quality of life and even self-harm or suicide when women feel trapped, like they're going nowhere, they can't change how they look, so they feel trapped and ultimately leads to lower quality of life. And the fix we believe is education. We can educate our youth in their most adaptable age and show them that it's okay not to fit into this narrow beauty ideal, and the system is also flawed. Now we'll look at more solutions.
The main solution that we touched on, that we came up with, was the education system, which we know, if you teach kids from an early age, those habits will stick to them. So teaching kids at an early age that everyone is different and that you don't have to look like all these models just to fit in. As Savannah said, also teaching the kids the truth about photos and how they have the watermarks and they're edited among all the rest of the photos, and how these photos are fake and how these kids can find that out. Another point is teaching these kids how to get help. Because when you're a kid, especially as a young man, you think that getting help is a sign of weakness, when in reality, it can save your life and save others' lives. So that's another education point. The second point, the solution that we think, is watermarks, as Savannah said again. Most of these photos that you find online are edited, and you can tell, as the picture on the left, it has the watermark of Getty Images, when this one is not. And so one solution that we think is removing all watermarks from images and only having the original image, or to show the original image next to the watermark image to show the original. And then the final solution that we have is diversity, because we think that if there's just the same race being shown, all these other races and people believe that, oh, I have to be that race to fit in, when in reality, you can be any race to fit in. Seeing one race makes people believe that, oh, this race and this body type is exactly what you need to be, when in reality it's not. And so with online photos, you mainly see a variety of all these fit women or men, and they're usually white, which in reality, all women can look like that and fit in.
Thank
Great. Ivy, how did your group decide to include ties, perspective, lens, or conclusions in the overall presentation?
Yeah, so we went through and basically our lenses were chosen based on what and who is affected by body image, or not body image, beauty standards. And one of the most overlooked ones is how men are affected. And we thought that was a really important thing to bring to the surface and look into and research, especially when it comes to making solutions, just because it is so often overlooked.
Great, thank you. Savannah, if you had another team member, what other perspectives or limitations could they have researched that would have made a useful contribution to your project?
Yeah, so I think if we had another member, something that we didn't go deeper into that I think we could was looking at the history of beauty standards and how they've changed and developed over time to see in different generations and different time periods what was desired and what was viewed as a suitable and expected standard for beauty.
Thank you. Noah, give one specific way your thinking changed as a result of learning about Ivy's findings.
As a male, I am not as into my looks as many females are. I know that females obviously are very, their looks matter to them a lot, like I mentioned earlier. And just the proportions that we're seeing up there, like the difference between a model and the difference between the average woman is just so interesting to me and so unfair that these women feel like they have to conform to this super, super unrealistic ideal, and just how, I don't want to say inhuman, but just not standard that the normal model is.
Great, thank you. Asher, what is a way in which your team's resolution makes you think differently about your own individual research?
I think with Savannah's, she brought up in her IR, and her idea for the solution was the watermark, which that was really smart because I always thought from my research that it was just about getting help and seeking therapy and doing this, but she brought up a really good point that it's just a simple fix that can really impact and help a lot of young adolescents all over the world.
Thank you. And Ty, what is an example of a compelling argument from one of your peers' individual reports that you decided to exclude from your presentation, and why?
So overall, throughout all of our IRRs, we all talked about kind of stuff similar, but we didn't end up excluding anything because we believed that every part of it meant something and showed, like, we were going to exclude mine about the men, but at the same time, the male population struggles just as much as the woman population, and same with races, so we just decided to include everything and thought it was important to include everything.
All right, that's it. Now you can push start and go.
Our group researched the topic of humor. Our research question was, how does negative humor determine one's identity and if they feel included or excluded in a social environment? Some context around this idea is that humor has existed for over 4,000 years, beginning nearly in the BC time frame and all the way up until now. This is significant because humor has been around that long that we need to pay attention to what is going on in our society today and how humor is impacted by it. The next thing is people are more likely to laugh when they're around people. Actually 30 times more likely to laugh when they're around people. This is also significant because our research question is based around the idea of humor being involved in social environments, and that is important as we are looking into how people interact with people. So throughout this presentation, we wanted to go into our 4 lenses: historical, scientific, social, and psychological. First, I'm going to hand it off to Lucy for historical.
When you think of the history of humor, you may not really want to think about it because it doesn't seem very interesting learning about where humor came from or the past. But throughout my research, I realized it's actually really important to think about where humor came from, as it helps understand the context behind if someone is included or excluded from a social environment. According to Charles Simon, humor once connected people through serious issues. Today it is often used to fit in socially. In the past, humor was used to connect people in social environments, rather as today it is used to connect with people in schools, businesses, anything like that. And so that's why it's really important to understand the history of humor as it connects us today. Understanding the context behind humor is also really important as well. If someone is connecting with someone in a social environment, understanding the context is helpful to understand if you're connected or excluded or included in an environment, because it could help give off a negative tone when you're talking to someone in those areas as well. Connection and belonging is also really important when talking about humor. So humor is used to express or share your feelings, and so when we understand that humor and understanding if it's a negative or a positive impact on how we connect with people today is really important when connecting with people and understanding where they come from. Generation does not matter. Humor has been around all the time, and humor is timeless. And so when connecting with someone from an older generation or even our present generation today, using humor is a way to connect with people and understand where they are coming from. Now Katie is going to talk a little bit about the scientific point of view with humor.
So the scientific part of it is, it's kind of, humor is just like, it naturally comes to us as humans. We just naturally use it in our everyday life. So according to Mikael Nordqvist, when we laugh, it releases endorphins, which is like the chemicals in our body that makes us just naturally feel good. So whenever we think something is funny and we use humor and laugh and stuff, then we just naturally feel good. And there have been many scientific studies researching humor and how it affects us as humans. And basically what they all find is that negative humor leads to bad results and positive humor leads to good results. And now I'm going to pass it off to Sam for the social.
Alright, so when I studied the social aspect of humor, I figured out that it's broken down into how humor is caused and how it's used. So humor is caused when violations of common social patterns happen, according to Strickland-Ford, such as knowing that it's not polite to burp in public, but burping anyways. Another cause is appreciation of incongruity or absurdity, according to Mamatha. It explains why we laugh at non-ordinary things, such as burping or loud noises. Humor's uses, it can either be used to unite or divide. When it's used to unite, it brings people together through mutual laughter, and when it divides, it brings people apart who don't share a common source of humor. We're going to pass it off to Sadie for psychology.
My research was mainly about the psychological lens of humor and how it is impacted. And I wanted to mainly go into the neurochemical and brain responses of humor and what it does. So starting off with dopamine and the emotional reward center, that is where when humor goes into the brain, Edwards states that it goes through the frontal lobe, which is where humans process information, all the way back to the supplementary motor area and then to the nucleus accumbens, which is where people are able to produce things such as dopamine and where that emotional reward center is triggered to where humor is produced. And then on the other side of things, the negative side of humor, stress and anxiety, is produced. And Brassler talks about how humor also has 4 very negative parts of it: sarcasm, irony, satire, cynicism, and these all lead to stress and anxiety, which is another thing about humor that is produced. And then how does all of these things come from the brain to the body? Well, Kwan talks about how genuine versus posed laughter and the difference between it. And genuine laughter is what is going to bring about humor in a good thing, and then posed laughter is going to bring humor in a negative light. And then lastly, Scott quotes about how laughter involves complex neural processing related to the social intent. This basically means that depending on the context, people are going to receive and give off humor in a certain way, which really includes them or excludes them from the social environment, going back to a research problem. So what are some solutions? I'm going to pass it off to Kaden again to talk about what we decided.
So our first possible solution is that we can decide to try and focus on self-depreciating humor so that it doesn't affect other people as much. So what does this even mean? Well, it means like your humor takes you and puts you in a lower position, so you're not putting other people in a lower position. So this makes you the target, and it doesn't really involve other people very much. So some pros and cons of this are, some pros are that other people around you won't feel like they're targeted by your humor. And then some studies have also suggested that when you use self-depreciating humor, it actually makes you feel better about yourself. And then some cons of this are that it shifts all the attention onto you, so it's not as connecting with other people because you're taking all the attention. And then it may come off differently to other people. They may think that you're just trying to get the attention and that you don't really care about them. And then, according to the systems thinker, we have found that many enlightened leaders have used this kind of self-depreciating humor as a way to create a safe environment for admitting mistakes. So this makes everyone feel like it's a safe environment to admit what they have done wrong. So now I'm going to pass it to Sam for the next solution.
So our second solution is close relationship humor, where you only share humor with people who you're close to and who are going to have the same social patterns as you. So this means you're really only going to talk to people in a humorous way that you know closely, because you're going to know the same social patterns and you're not going to risk offending them as much. And you're going to want to avoid talking to strangers, because when you try to share a joke with them, they might not know what you're talking about. Some pros and cons. Humor will almost always be understood with your family. You'll all have inside jokes that you'll all understand. And there's a very low risk of offending your family if you're not trying. As far as cons go, you're going to be limited to how many people you can joke with, unless you have a large family. And there's still a small risk that you are going to offend your family. So back to you.
To wrap this up, we came up with 3 main points. Number 1 is humor equals destruction, or humor equals connection, sorry. Throughout time and throughout history, we have realized that humor has always been around and that it connects many different cultural groups and ethnic groups, and you can always use humor in whatever situation you're in. Alternatively, humor can also equal possible destruction. If given or taken in a negative way, humor can lead to you feeling negatively about yourself and feeling less about yourself as well. And through Sadie and Caden's research, humor also affects our brain chemistry. And this could be detrimental, as it can affect our mental health and then later lead to our physical health and our well-being. Thank you.
Okay. Sadie, please give one specific way your thinking changed as a result of learning about Lucy's findings.
I would say for my personal part, is it okay that this video stopped?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I would say for my personal understanding of my research compared to Lucy's, she kind of taught me that humor is very situational, and then it also, depending on how long it has spanned from history, it really doesn't matter that maybe the mediums have changed or the way people are using jokes, but in the grand scheme of things, that the history of humor has stayed the same, in the sense that people are continuously using humor, whether it's in one form or another. It really doesn't matter. It's a universal thing.
Thank you. Lucy, what is an example of a compelling argument from one of your peers' individual reports that you decided to exclude from your presentation, and why?
Overall, Sam's research was really good, and it was really interesting to learn about the social aspect and the social lens. Although we realized that how you interact with people socially can be from Sadie and Caden's perspective of the chemical things going on in your brain, and also the psychological aspect is that how you interact socially depends on that. And so we decided to tone in more on the Caden and Sadie's lens on that instead.
Okay, thank you. Caden, describe an argument from one of your peers' individual reports that made you think differently about your team's solution or conclusion?
Yeah, so Sadie's research really kind of did a good job of explaining to me what it actually does, brain, what humor, how it actually affects our brain and what it makes us feel like and act like. So I think her research was a big contribution to getting good solutions and a good conclusion of how to make good humor and not negative humor.
Thank you. Sam? If you had another team member, what other perspectives or limitations could they have researched that would have made a useful contribution to the project?
I really think we had a good spread overall of topics that covered a lot of things, but if I could have another member, I would want them to do politically. I would have liked to gone really deep into how political humor is used in settings and maybe how that affected nations maybe and the rise and fall of power in different societies.
Great, thank you very much.
Presentation on government abuse. So, throughout history, governments have claimed more power than they're allowed to in the name of security, process, or stability. And as we know, the government's job is to protect the people under them, to protect us. And when no one is watching, they can use this power against the very same people that they swore to protect by isolating certain groups to label them as threats. Governments have done this and they've justified their actions through this. And as we know, the effects last far longer than just in the moment of these isolated groups. And as we know, in the 90s or in the 1900s, multiple of these occasions of isolations have happened throughout this whole year, even though there was before the 1800s with slavery and after. Our main focus was through these isolation groups that happened because as we know today, just to put it into perspective, we think that the 1900s isn't that long ago, but we have people who are alive and well today who testify against government abuse, and we know these people as our grandparents and our great-grandparents.
So we each divided up the research question into different lenses that were different isolated events that happened in history that exemplified government abuse and manipulation of minorities. So the first group was the Holocaust, and this was my research. And then we also looked at prior solutions that people have posed to these tragedies. So the Holocaust is pretty well known, but we all know that the Nazi regime targeted the Jews and manipulated the public into thinking that they were different from them. And prior solutions that I noticed in my research, people brought up acknowledgement and responsibility, and they looked for someone to blame. And then Ben's lens was women's rights, specifically in the United States. So a solution for that was the 19th Amendment, which gave women suffrage, and then also they tried to eliminate the pay gap, and these solutions did not work because sexism can still be seen in today's world. And then Cora looked at Japanese Americans specifically during World War II with the internment camps. And in her research, a lot of people posed awareness and building communities as solutions. And then Jeremiah looked at slavery, and to get rid of slavery, we had the 13th Amendment, but effects of racism can still be seen today. And then Jax looked at government agencies, and people have tried to expose the corruption, but the truth is that we don't really know everything that goes on, so there's no way for us to expose everything that happens.
Alright, so these are two solutions that we came up with that are both possibilities. The first one is a stronger system of accountability for citizens and the government, and very clear transparency and oversight from independent organizations that can be created either inside the government or outside the government. And the next solution is that we could just do nothing and let the government carry on with their actions without any oversight or protection of individual rights. And those are our two solutions, and both of them offer some valid reasons as to why they can be reliable, and both of them also have limitations, and both of them also have pros and cons that can be considered from all angles and perspectives.
Alright, so our first solution is a stronger system of accountability. And throughout history, there have been multiple examples of governments that have had too much power and have abused that power. And our first example is in the 1800s when companies would hide behind the term legal at the time, and that would prevent them from basically paying reparations or apologizing for what they did. Another example would be in the 1960s when the FBI came out and they said that they were spying on MLK before he died. And that's just another example of it. Some less notable ones are during World War II, there was a lot going on, especially with everything that's happening in Europe with the Jewish people and the Holocaust. That was a power that got too much of it and ended up abusing all of it. And then while that was happening, back in the United States, Japanese people were experiencing racism and discrimination where they were being labeled as the enemy race. And in a specific case, Korematsu versus the United States, it was the Supreme Court that basically made sure and solidified the fact that at the time, Japanese people were seen as the enemy race. All right, some pros and cons of this would be, some pros would be the fact that having this solution would lessen the chances of it happening in the future. And of course, this would be a great thing because a stronger system of accountability will have oversight over lesser powers and make sure that they can't get too powerful. Some cons would be the fact that human greed has always been a problem throughout history, and you can see that with the examples on the last slide, such as the Nazis and such as governments that just get too much power and end up abusing it. And what tends to happen is when humans get presented with all that power, they sometimes tend to make the problem worse than it was before. And although there are some cons and a lot of pros for this solution, in my opinion, the pros far outweigh the cons, and it'll help if we at least try to make this solution happen.
Our second solution is inaction. We do nothing, we let the government carry on how it is with no oversight, but this, while at first it seems like, well, that's a bad idea, we would like for this to be happening. We would like for us to have complete faith that our government will do everything they can to protect us and that they will do their best to protect our rights and freedoms and as such. So we have a few pros and cons for this. First few pros, we have the trust in government, and that, as I said, it helps have faith that they can do what they can for us. We also have faster action and autonomy for the government without having to go through a bunch of checks and balances. They can do whatever they have to protect us quicker without risks in the future, which is the ideal solution. But sadly, oftentimes when that happens, we don't always see that to be true. Throughout history, there has been times where no power checks and unrestricted power has caused many abuses in the US government specifically, such as the CIA torture scandal throughout the Middle East in the post 9/11 era. This was seen through Richardson, who went in depth and identified many of the problems where people would be taken from their country and oftentimes tortured for information as the CIA tried to figure out future terrorist attacks to prevent and almost would go too far in defending the nation's security. Oftentimes, locally, the FBI and CIA have spied on their own citizens in order to do this again, to try and protect our citizens and our freedoms, but oftentimes go too far in the name of security. So the implications of doing this would require full trust in the government at the end of it. There would be no safeguards for us, but it would be best if we would have a system that we could fully trust that they would do everything for us. Limitations would include having unlawful action, or the implications would continue at the possible unlawful actions that would be a cause of this, such as the torture and the spying that we will not know anything about because there would be no system in place to try and protect us. As such, unlimited power might sound good for them, but not always good for the people of the U.S.
All right, conclusion. Basically, we think that the first solution to have a stronger system of accountability and create organizations is the better one. Throughout studying the history, when we learn from the past, and from the past we can create solutions such as the ones we just created. Throughout examples such as Diana's in the Holocaust, and Cora's in Japanese internment, Jackson's in government corruption, and Jeremiah's in slavery, and mine through women's rights, we can see these solutions. And without a strong system of accountability, freedom can be at risk, and unfortunately that can come at the cost of democracy, which cannot be beneficial at all lots of the time. And yeah, and to end it off, read a quote: "The past cannot be changed, the future is yet in your power." Mary Pickford. Thank you.
Cora, what is an example of a compelling argument from one of your peers' IRRs that you decided to exclude from your presentation, and why?
Yeah, so for Diana's research, although she had an amazing research on the Holocaust, we did have to exclude hers because we wanted to really narrow our research down and focus on the United States government. And as we know, the Holocaust did not take place in the United States. And although she did have research on propaganda and the bystander effect, she was able to also connect it to the U.S., which we did put some in, but unfortunately we weren't able to put her court argument into into our presentation.
Thank you. Diana, if you had another team member, what other perspective or limitation could they have researched that would have made a useful contribution to the project?
If we had another teammate, I would have liked to see them focus on something that's still going on today, because a lot of our topics, and most of them, did happen in the past. Like the Holocaust is not still going on today. So it would have been interesting to know and be aware of things that are happening in our lifetime.
Thank you. Ben, what is a way in which your team's resolution makes you think differently about your own individual research?
Well, it would have made me specifically research times in which women's rights was not incorporated into our solution, in which governments did not have committees created for them, such as the 19th Amendment that was made by the government and the in Congress. So if we didn't have since I didn't have the team solution in mind when doing my research, I didn't think of these possible solutions, but doing the research with the solution would have helped, because it would have made me think deeper into what could have been done, and it could have helped me maybe elaborate a little bit more on my research and expand it outside of what has already been shown.
Okay, thank you. Jerry, describe an argument from one of your peers' IRR that made you think differently about your team's solution or conclusion.
Yeah, so I'd say Jax's research would probably do that, because a lot of the research we did, because we had to adapt our research question to fit align with a lot of the research we did, and I feel like Jax's stayed true to the original one, as in finding out the most present day problems that were happening. So I feel like after I read Jax's, everybody else's was good too, but I read Jax's and I thought, this problem is still existing today and it still needs a solution.
And Jax, reflecting on your colleagues' work, which one had the greatest impact on your overall understanding of the problem your group identified?
Well, I would say that Jerry's had the biggest effect, because his was probably the farthest in the past, and when you think of slavery, you really think of it was in the past. It's not happening now. But he found a way that even when we were changing our research question to fit more modern, more US, that he found a way to tie slavery back then into current issues now, such as modern trafficking of children and all that. And he found a good way to just tie the past to the modern age.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, so our question is, how does the media's portrayal of immigrants as bad people affect them and making them feel like others? For more than a century, the media has played a huge role in shaping how immigrants are viewed by everyone. From early newspapers in the 1800s to modern day news, immigrants are often portrayed as dangerous criminals or burdens to society. This can influence laws, public attitudes of immigrants, their feeling of belonging, and making them feel like others. So we are going to go over how culture, social media, history, and legislation affect immigrants and making them feel like others.
The media's negative portrayal of immigrant culture affects them in society, making them feel different, as if their culture is not understood by the general public, making them feel as a social outgroup, whereas the positive perception of their culture can lead them to feel accepted and help them change society around them. Authors Christina Talon and Jessica Dyler, both professors, argue that misunderstandings happen within many groups, even with people who are similar. These attitudes and behaviors of people towards immigrants change, and so does the dynamic. Through this and the treatment of immigrants, this causes them to lose respect of their own culture, and they might hide from it. This evidence is logical because it shows that misunderstandings can shift the mindset of people everywhere, and it causes immigrants to not be respected. Through this isolation and being an outsider, immigrants are led to feel as if they do not have any purpose. When immigrants are positively portrayed, they feel like their culture can strike change. Americans tend to believe that immigrants are just a small part of society and can't make a difference. Authors Nancy Foner, who is a professor in society at Hunter College, shares that the 87 million immigrants and their families have been a prominent source of and profound and far-reaching changes in the social, economic, and cultural and political landscape in many significant ways. This number might come as a surprise to some people, but statistics prove that immigration can change minds and really help improve society. How media portrays immigrants can affect them greatly, negatively making them feel misunderstood, and positively helping them make a difference. The general public can do their part by not being quick to judge and showing respect for other cultures.
Online and social sentiment of immigrants has led into heightened levels of stress, the growth of a hateful community, and solidarity and positivity in immigrant communities. Social media personally attacks immigrants while trying to rally support against their existence, ultimately degrading them and their mental health. Furthermore, external stressors can further worsen mental health. Kyriaki Kosidou and others, all professors of neurology and public health, researched the mental health effects of social pressures on new immigrants, finding psychological distress and lifetime suicide attempts were 50% and twice as common in women as in men, as well as a Uruguay study revealing that a social identity crisis has provoked a negative response, suggesting a large concern for mental ill health in immigrants. Constance de Saint-Laurent, Vlad Glavinou, and Claude Chadet, professors researched anti-immigration posts on Twitter, searching for hate in communities. Sampling hashtags over a 3-month period in 2018, they found that the hashtags build the wall, illegal aliens, and secure the border collected 87,929 posts in a single day, while pro-immigration posts under the hashtags with refugees, refugees welcome, and no border had 24,860 posts in the same day. Alongside the sheer volume of daily tweets, many of them cover the same 3 topics ad nauseum, lacking insightful conversation with the purpose of feeding into an already active community of hate. This dense and solidified landscape of ideas contributed to an echo chamber of loud, unchanging ideas that continue to prod at the public perception of immigrants and their mental health. Oops, sorry. Alright. In the face of disgust eliciting language and negativity, many immigrants can use social media as a means to come together in solidarity. Dr. Jin Kyung Jung and fellow instructors at Texas Tech and Michigan State studied the importance of fibrous solidarity as a tenet of the internet, and have found that by emphasizing narrative-driven storytelling, this tenet underscores the significance of collective expression with varied communities, enabling them to share, preserve, and reconstruct memories while unearthing hidden histories. This form of solidarity is an important facet of immigrant culture, accessible through the internet. This availability allows our people to tap into their cultural identities and histories, bringing them together. Furthermore, informed citizens and those with experience in migration have an opportunity on social media to spread a positive view. Andrea Nocito and Francisco Rao, professors of geographic analysis, studied the polarization of anti-immigration on Twitter, finding pro-migration tweets were accounted for 27.96% of all research posts, while anti-immigration were accountable for 19.73%. Catherine Rohr and her team also reported that sentiments improve while tweets trend negatively, revealing that social media can be a net positive despite its negative face. Now Collier will talk about the historical relevance.
So historically, the media has portrayed immigrants as less than human. So this is a pattern that goes back from the 1800s to today, and they've been long portrayed as less than human, with the media narratives shaping not only public opinion, but also how the immigrants experience society. And early on, the media relied on dehumanizing metaphors and hostile language, and this framed them as threats rather than as humans. This led to the normalization of exclusion and mistreatment. As immigration has become more politicized, media outlets and news sources portrayed them as hostile to society and also to the economy. And they are often framed as people who take more than they can give and are high cost to the country. This fueled dislikes of immigrants and reduced support for supportive policies that would have helped them. This justifies stricter laws by presenting them as burdens. As these narratives repeat over time, the immigrants were pushed into the title of outsiders, and this continued with the use of hostile language, imagery, and emotional rhetoric, creating a long cycle of dehumanization, which leads immigrants to feel insignificant and as others. And now Michael will continue with more legislative.
So the media uses dehumanizing rhetoric and, like what Collier says, frames immigrants as a high cost, which in turn leads to the creation of a hostile environment towards immigrants. The public lives in this hostile environment, and that influences them to pass anti-immigration laws and policies. They use dehumanizing rhetoric such as calling immigrants like vermin or rats, and that further influences the public to come up with a solution to get rid of the vermin problem. And, yeah. Now Abby will talk about the first solution we have to this problem.
The first solution is the addition of media literacy costs. This cost would educate students on how to check sources for accuracy with guest speakers that talk about their personal stories on hot topics. Dario Toval puts it this way: media literacy is a very necessary cost that can help us realize that our words carry weight and rid our creations of bias. In interviewing an immigrant, Rosaba Gonzalez-Hill, who has become a teacher and has her master's degree in education, she says that she's been teaching immigration as a topic in a part of her classes for a very long time, and everything has become very political. If an immigrant does something bad, it's highlighted. And if people were to be educated and informed on how to accurately digest the news, it would help because you would know how to understand the things you see. People believe what they want, and social media makes that worse. Some of the positives of this solution is that kids will learn how to digest the things they see, and it gets them more experience in understanding the things in the real world, teaching those who will be the main parts of society. The negatives is that kids might not care and they have low attention spans. and there can be a lack of class structure and poor teaching qualifications. Now on to Mikey to talk about the second solution.
The second solution for our problem is to have the federal government take control or refine media outlets based on how they portray immigrants, using hyperbolizing the downsides of immigration or including unfair narratives. The government can either forcefully take control of the media outlets or use AI to enforce rules and find them. There's already AI that exists that is unbiased and can be used to scan news outlets for unfair rhetoric that is used against immigrants. Some positives of this is that it solves discrimination by removing the chance of it if the government forcefully takes control of media outlets. However, the First Amendment in the US Constitution protects the freedom of speech and press, and there is no way to prove that someone is biased against something, as what one person views as offensive could be viewed as humorous to another. Now, how do you talk about the best solution we have to this problem?
Okay. Solution 1, where schools implement a media literacy course with occasional guest speakers would be the best solution because it can stifle the flow of biases while being flawless in how it can incorporate a necessary skill into the coming generation or the most promising change makers for the future. These methods are proven effective in the way that Abby previously talked about, allowing us to usher in educated thinkers as they begin to digest the media and the world around them. The major drawbacks of this, however, are that schools can only partially be relied upon to properly educate a class of this style, as our private schools cannot have the same governmental reach as public, and managing the quality of education across the nation may suffer in some ways where funding is already low. Otherwise, student participation or impact could differ without a way to manage. Students too young may have difficulties focusing, and these issues could have a lesser impact on them as they don't see it important, while high school students could be too old and they may have already damaged their society around them, and it also doesn't have an impact on them. Nevertheless, with a focus on late elementary school, such as 4th, 5th, or 6th grade, or even middle school students, the pros outweigh the cons for this not to be the best solution. So to conclude, cultural misinterpretation and social media negativity have historically influenced legislation, though this can be stifled by targeting the youth to make a change.
Collier, what is a way in which your team's resolution makes you think differently about your own individual research?
So Mikey's research helps me realize that we need how the media prioritizes like profit and stuff, and how we need to be focusing more on the education of how to stop it and like what we need to stop.
Thank you. Abigail, how did your group decide to include Mikey's perspective, lens, or conclusions in the overall presentation?
So we decided to include Mikey's research because we thought it was really important to talk about how different laws that are passed in different legislation acts are really important, and how they really change like immigration or immigrants' like lifestyles in general, like allowing them to either come across the border or after they've crossed, like what different rights they have and stuff like that. And we thought that like the rhetoric that he used too was really important, and especially in the solving of our solution. And we thought like start with the students and work our way up.
Thank you. Eddie, give one specific way your thinking changed as a result of learning about Abby's findings.
So Abby's findings focused a lot on like the broader like implications that different things, especially like misinterpretation in the media and immigrants feeling like an out group could have on immigrants themselves and later generations down the line. And so because my research was more focused on just social media, I think having hers that focused on like everything really helped me realize that this is way beyond just like the psyche and beyond like the way that they can personally, but like them as a group, as well as the way that the entire media instead of just social media can impact them. So yeah, it just really opened my eyes to how much bigger it is.
Mikey, describe an argument from one of your peers' individual reports that made you think differently about your team's solution or your team's conclusion.
So, one of Collier's arguments was that a more accurate media would remove biases about immigrants and just portray them as they really are. However, we decided to exclude this, and could you repeat that question?
Yes. Describe an argument from one of your peers' individual reports that made you think differently about your team's solution or conclusion.
So, Collier's argument was that a more accurate media would be more beneficial, and a media without bias would remove all the negativity about immigrants. However, this made me think differently about our team's solution, because if this is a really feasible and realistic solution, it would have happened already, and our solution was it made me realize that not every solution can be realistic or feasible. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, those of you that are grading, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to put down your final thoughts there. If you are done with the form,